This week, somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 people ran, swam, and climbed their way into a 2-square-mile Spanish enclave on the coast of Africa. 57 of them didn't make it out alive. You've probably already seen the footage. Young men pouring over a breakwater fence, families sleeping on sidewalks, a Spanish prime minister flying in, looking shell-shocked, and within hours, the internet had already picked its side. Half the comments section is screaming, "Invasion." The other half is screaming, "Colonialism." Both sides are performing outrage at each other, instead of asking the one question that actually matters here. Why did 50,000 people decide, within the space of about 24 hours, that this was the moment to risk their lives? Here's the thing you already suspect, even if nobody said it out loud yet. This wasn't a spontaneous act of aggression, and it wasn't a spontaneous act of desperation either. It was a predictable output of two broken machines running at the same time. You don't need a headline that tells you who to blame. You need a framework that tells you how to read it. Because this exact scene is going to repeat, somewhere else, with a different flag on each side of the fence, and you'll want to already know what you're looking at. That's what this video is going to give you. Not a verdict on migrants, not a verdict on Spain. A working model, borrowed from 3 economists who spent their careers explaining exactly this kind of event. For reading any border crisis without falling for the cultural explanation the media on both sides is going to hand you within the next 48 hours. Frédéric Bastiat wrote about the difference between what you see and what you don't see. Friedrich Hayek spent a career explaining what happens when a government can't get information to its own citizens fast enough. And Thomas Sowell built an entire body of work around one blunt observation: institutions, not identities, produce outcomes. By the end of this video, you'll be able to look at a stampede on the news and immediately locate the 2 or 3 institutional failures sitting underneath it, instead of the ethnic or cultural story someone's trying to sell you. So let's start with the number that actually explains this. Not the 57 dead. The other one. The one from 4 months before anyone climbed a fence. Let's start with the number nobody was filming 4 months ago, because it wasn't dramatic enough for a headline. In late September 2025, thousands of young Moroccans, organized almost entirely through Discord and TikTok, with no official leader anyone could name, took to the streets in at least 11 cities. They weren't protesting a border, they were protesting hospitals. A cluster of women had died giving birth in a public hospital in Agadir. Youth unemployment was sitting near 36%. And the government had just committed close to €1 billion towards stadium renovations for the 2030 World Cup, while the country runs on roughly 7.7 medical professionals per 10,000 people. The protest signs said it plainly: dignity before stadiums. That protest ended the way these things usually end: a royal speech promising reform, a spending bill, thousands facing charges in court, and the cameras moving on to the next story. 4 months later, the cameras came back, except this time, instead of marching toward a hospital, 50 to 60,000 people were marching toward a fence. Here's what almost nobody connects out loud. These are not 2 separate stories. They're the same story, at 2 different exit doors of the same building. This is where Frédéric Bastiat becomes useful. Bastiat's most famous idea is about what is seen versus what is not seen. The visible, dramatic event in front of you versus the slow, invisible chain of decisions that actually produced it. What you see this week is a stampede at a border fence. What you don't see is a decade of underfunded hospitals, a labor market that can't absorb its own graduates, and a government that had to choose, and chose stadiums. Nobody's arguing intent here. Nobody in Rabat sat in a room and planned a migration crisis. But Bastiat's whole point is that you don't need a villain twirling a mustache. You just need decision-makers who keep discounting the invisible, long-term cost of a broken institution in favor of the visible, short-term win of a new stadium. The border stampede isn't the disease. It's the symptom finally becoming visible enough for a camera crew to notice. Thomas Sowell would take it one step further. Sowell spent decades arguing that outcomes track institutions, not culture, not identity, not who these people are. Two populations with the same aspirations, the same work ethic, the same desire to build a life, placed inside different institutional environments, produce wildly different outcomes, give people functioning courts, secure property rights, and a labor market that can actually absorb them, and they build. Don't, and the ambitious ones leave, by whatever route is in front of them. And this is where the number the strategist flagged actually earns its place. Morocco currently sits 83rd out of the world's ranked economies on the Heritage Foundation's 2026 Index of Economic Freedom, moderately free, which sounds fine until you look at the components underneath it. Government integrity scores in the 30s. Judicial efficiency scores in the 30s. Rule of law, the thing that lets you trust a contract, trust a court, trust that your effort will actually be rewarded, is explicitly rated weak. Meanwhile, the country's monetary and business freedom scores are genuinely solid, well above the world average. This isn't a poor country with no capacity. It's a country where the rule of law plumbing is broken while other pipes work fine. That's not a culture problem. That's an institutions problem. And Sowell would tell you, it's the only kind of problem that actually predicts outcomes. Now put yourself in the shoes of a 16-year-old scrolling Instagram, watching videos of people crossing a fence 12 hours away. You're not choosing between my country and their country as some kind of loyalty test. You're choosing between an institutional environment that keeps discounting your future and a 12-hour drive. Reuters actually talked to one of these kids, Ayoub El Abiad, who made exactly that drive with his cousin. He didn't describe rage. He didn't describe hatred of Morocco. He described improving his life, a completely rational, completely legible response to an environment that a judicial efficiency score of 32 out of 100 has been quietly narrating for years. This is the part that should actually make you angry, not at Ayoub, and not at Morocco as a country, but at the specific, nameable institutional failures that keep producing this exact pressure valve, generation after generation. A 16-year-old's 12-hour bet isn't proof that something is culturally wrong with the people making that bet. It's proof that something is structurally wrong with the building they're leaving. Once you can see that distinction, you can't unsee it. And it's the only honest place to start, because the border they were running toward has its own broken plumbing too. Now flip to the other side of the fence, because Spain's failure here is a different species entirely. And it's arguably the more interesting one, because it's not about poverty, it's about information. Here's what actually happened, stripped of spin. On June 29, 2026, Spain's Supreme Court issued a ruling, Judgment 814/2026, on a narrow, technical legal question. It didn't say, you can enter Spain if you swim. It said something much smaller, that Spain's fast-track hot return mechanism, which lets border agents immediately hand someone back across the fence, legally applies only to people who physically climb over a barrier. It does not apply to people intercepted swimming through open water, because they haven't technically breached a containment element. That's it. A jurisdictional footnote about the legal definition of offense. That ruling sat quietly for about 3 weeks. Then, according to Spain's own prime minister, trafficking networks took that narrow legal footnote and repackaged it into something else entirely. A rumor that swimming into Ceuta now meant guaranteed entry into Europe. That rumor in the Prime Minister's own words, spread like wildfire through informal networks in a matter of hours. Instagram videos of people crossing did the rest. Notably, activists on the Moroccan side pushed back on this explanation, arguing most of the people who crossed likely never even heard of the ruling, which tells you this wasn't a single clean cause, but a stew of economic desperation, the ruling's distorted echo, and plain social media contagion. All the accuracy caveats we owe the story stack up here. Nobody knows the exact weighting of those three ingredients yet, and treating any one of them as the singular trigger would be dishonest. But the mechanism itself, a real legal decision, badly communicated, mutating as it travels through informal channels until it produces an outcome nobody who wrote the ruling intended. That's not speculation. That's a documented pattern, and it has a name. Friedrich Hayek spent much of his career on a single problem. No central authority, no government, no court, no ministry can ever hold or transmit all the information relevant to a decision as fast or as accurately as it actually moves through a decentralized system. Knowledge is scattered, partial, and constantly being reinterpreted as it passes from person to person. Hayek's point wasn't that centralized institutions are evil. It's that they are structurally incapable of controlling how information behaves once it leaves their hands, and the gap between what an institution says and what people end up believing is where chaos lives. A Supreme Court can rule with total legal precision on a Monday. By Thursday, that ruling can be circulating as a completely different claim, stripped of every qualifier, running through channels, trafficker networks, encrypted group chats, Instagram algorithms, that no press release ever reaches in time to correct. Nobody planned the stampede. Nobody at the court wanted it. The information simply did what information does when a centralized source fails to keep pace with a decentralized network, eager to fill in the blanks. Now translate that back to your own life for a second, because you've lived a smaller version of this. You've seen a policy change get announced, and by the time it reaches your group chat, it's not the policy anymore. It's a rumor, wearing the policy's name. A tax rule becomes, "They're coming for your savings." A court decision about immigration procedure becomes, "The border's open." The mechanism is identical, whether the stakes are a group chat or a stampede that kills 57 people. An institution issues something precise. The decentralized network it can't control does the rest, and the institution finds out what it actually said only after the damage is done. This is the second broken machine. Not corruption, not malice. A government that, like most governments, still communicates like it's the only source of information in the room, while the actual information environment its citizens and neighbors live in has already moved on without it. Spain didn't intend this outcome any more than Morocco intended its youth to leave. But intention was never the requirement for the failure. The plumbing simply gave out on both ends of the pipe at once. And that's exactly the kind of double failure that should make you angry at the right target, instead of the easiest one. So let's put both machines on the table at once, because side by side, they tell you something neither one tells you alone. On one side of that fence, a country scoring 61.8 out of 100 on economic freedom, ranked 83rd globally, with a rule of law backbone weak enough that 4 months before this crisis, thousands of its own young citizens were in the streets, over hospitals, without doctors, and a government that chose stadiums instead. On the other side, a country whose own Supreme Court issued a narrow, 3-week-old technical ruling that got mistranslated by informal networks into an entirely different claim before anyone in government could catch up with it. 2 separate institutions, 2 separate failure modes. Same week, same fence. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a culture clash. It's what happens whenever weak state capacity, on one side of a border, meets poor state communication on the other. You don't need who these people are to explain 50,000 crossings and 57 deaths. You need exactly the two variables we just walked through, and nothing else. This is where Ayoub el-Abyad's own words matter more than any statistic. A 16-year-old, watching a phone screen, made a completely rational calculation. A 12-hour drive against a lifetime, inside an institutional environment that had already shown its hand at the Agadir protests. He didn't describe hatred of his country. He didn't describe a plot against Spain. He described improving his life. That is rational self-interest, in its most stripped-down, undeniable form. A young person reading his own institutional environment correctly, and acting on it, exactly the way Sowell would predict, and exactly the way any of us would, if we were standing in his shoes with his information. And here's the uncomfortable part for people on every side of this argument. If you're the kind of person who reflexively calls this an invasion, you have to explain why a teenager risking his life for better job prospects is somehow more sinister than a teenager doing the exact same calculation by applying to a university abroad. It's the same self-interested logic, just without the visa. If you're the kind of person who reflexively calls this colonialism or blames Spain alone, you have to explain the 11-city hospital protest that happened 4 months earlier, entirely independent of Spain, entirely about Morocco's own institutions. Neither script survives contact with the actual sequence of events. Only the institutional read does. This is also where the numbers deserve one more honest caveat before we move on. The casualty count, 57, and the crossing count, an estimated 50,000 to 60,000, depending on whether you're citing Spain's Interior Ministry or Ceuta's regional government, are both still being reported as of July 31, 2026, and both are the kind of figures that tend to shift in the days after a crisis like this. We're not treating either number as a closed, final tally. We're treating them as the best available reporting from Reuters, CNN, and Al Jazeera at time of filming, which is exactly how you should treat every breaking news number you see this week, on this story or the next one. Here's the frame, distilled down to something you can actually carry with you. Every mass border event you will ever see in your life runs on some combination of these two failure modes. A sending state that can't deliver rule of law, opportunity, or basic dignity to its own productive, ambitious young people, and a receiving state that can't communicate its own laws clearly enough to stop a rumor from doing the governing for it. Neither failure requires villainy. Neither failure requires a culture to blame. Both failures are entirely, boringly institutional, which is actually the good news, because institutions can be measured, diagnosed, and fixed in ways that who these people are never can. The moment you can say, that's a rule of law gap, and that's a communication failure, instead of reaching for a flag or an ethnicity, you've done something most of the commentary around this story never manages to do. You've stopped being useful to whichever side wants your outrage, and started being accurate instead. Here's the bigger thing worth sitting with, once the cameras leave Ceuta, because they will, probably by next week. Every time one of these events happens, you're handed two cheap stories for free. One tells you to fear the people crossing. The other tells you to blame the country receiving them. Both stories are emotionally satisfying, and both stories let you stop thinking the second you've picked a side. What we just walked through is neither of those. It's slower, less satisfying to shout about, and far more useful. Two separate institutions, thousands of miles apart in their politics, but identical in their failure mode, both quietly discounting the people who depend on them until the bill came due at the same fence, in the same week. That's the actual through line of everything on this channel. Not, Which government do you hate more? Whether an institution, any institution, in any country, run by any party, actually does the one job it exists to do: protect your ability to build a life through your own effort, without a court, a rumor, or a stadium contract getting in the way. Ceuta isn't a story about Morocco or Spain. It's a story about what happens, anywhere, when that job goes undone on both ends at once. If this is the kind of lens you want applied to the next crisis before the outrage machine gets there first, and there will be a next one, that's exactly what this channel does every week. The most useful thing you can do right now isn't to comment invasion or colonialism in the box below. It's to hit subscribe, so you've got this framework loaded before the next fence makes the news. And if you want to see this same institutional lens applied somewhere much closer to home, not a border, but a welfare system quietly eating its own city from the inside, go watch the episode right before this one. Same method, completely different setting, same result. The villain was never who you were told it was. Now here's what I actually want from you. Forget, who do you side with? I don't want that fight in the comments. I want you to name the last policy or court ruling you saw get completely warped by the time it reached your group chat. What was the original ruling, and what did it turn into by the time your cousin forwarded it to you? Put it below. I read every one.